I still read every medical chart twice. Not because I don't trust my own diagnosis. I do, after 12 years of training, of sleepless nights, of holding strangers' lives in my hands, until I learned the weight of that responsibility. I read them twice because I learned, early and brutally, that the people who should protect you are the ones who know how to forge a signature, how to sedate a mind, how to make theft look like love. My father taught me to read blueprints before I could read books. He taught me that a building is only as strong as its foundation, that shortcuts lead to collapse, that the structures we build outlast the names we carve on them. He did not teach me that a will could be forged, that a signature could be guided by a hand that wasn't yours, that a daughter could be erased from her own history while she was trying to save someone else's life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You don't know me yet. You don't know about Valeria. You don't know about the video an old nurse took on his phone in secret because something didn't smell right. My name is Camilla. I'm 33 years old. And this is the story of how my father gave my inheritance to his new wife's son, and how I proved the will was forged, exposed a predator, and turned a house of theft into a house of healing. Welcome to Little Bunny Stories. If you're new here, this is where we tell the truth about families that rewrite history while you're not looking. If you've ever had someone smile at you while they emptied your father's accounts, if you've ever been called ungrateful while you were being disinherited, subscribe. We have stories for you every week. And we read every comment. Here's my story. I was 15 when my mother died. Ovarian cancer, aggressive, 6 months from diagnosis to funeral. She was 44. She'd been a nurse, not a doctor, not a specialist, but the kind of nurse who remembered patients' birthdays, who brought homemade food to families in waiting rooms, who held hands when doctors delivered bad news. She was the foundation of our family. The structure that held up my father's ambition, my childhood, his belief that he deserved the world because he'd built part of it. My father, Martin, was a real estate developer. Not the glamorous kind you see on television, the practical kind, apartment complexes, shopping centers, warehouses. He made money by understanding what people needed before they knew they needed it. He was good at his job. He was terrible at grief. When my mother died, he didn't collapse. He disappeared into work. 17-hour days, 7-day weeks, projects that multiplied like cells in the cancer that had taken her. He came home at midnight, smelling of concrete and whiskey, and sat in her chair, the one by the window where she'd read, staring at nothing. I became his administrator, not by choice, by vacuum. Someone had to pay bills, schedule maintenance, pretend we were still a family. I was 15. I learned to balance checkbooks, to negotiate with contractors, to cook dinners that went uneaten. I learned that grief doesn't always look like tears. Sometimes it looks like absence. Sometimes it looks like a man who builds things because he can't bear to live in what he's already built. At 17, I told him I wanted to be a doctor. Not a developer, not his successor. A doctor. Useful, he said, not looking up from his blueprints. Medicine is practical. People always get sick. He paid for my education. Not generously, transactionally. Tuition, housing, a monthly allowance that covered basics. He never visited my campus. He never attended my white coat ceremony. He called on birthdays, 30-second conversations that felt like business check-ins. How are your grades? Good. Keep working. I told myself this was his love language: distance, money, the absence of demand. I told myself a lot of things at 22 when I started medical school, when I left the city, when I finally broke the orbit of a house that felt like a museum to a dead woman. I came back at 28, a resident physician, exhausted, proud, ready to reconnect. I'd called less during residency, 12-hour shifts, 30-hour calls, the brutal education of learning to keep people alive. My father hadn't complained. He never complained. He just deposited money and waited. I found him changed. Not softer, not healed, but occupied. He had a girlfriend, Valeria. 38 years old, 15 years younger than him, 20 years younger than my mother would have been. She was beautiful in a way that looked expensive, maintained, curated, the product of effort and resources. She'd been a model, she said, a flight attendant. She'd traveled the world and chosen to settle with him. I met her at dinner. A restaurant he owned, private room, candles that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She kissed my cheek before I offered it, held my hand too long, smiled with teeth that were too white and too even. Camilla, she purred. Martin talks about you constantly. His brilliant daughter, the doctor, he didn't talk about me constantly. He barely talked about me at all, but I smiled. I was trained in bedside manner. I knew how to perform warmth for people I didn't trust. She had a son, Tomás. 19, handsome in a lazy way, the kind of young man who'd learned early that charm was currency and that older women were atoms. He shook my hand, held it too long, asked about my doctor money and whether I could spot him 500 for a course. I gave him the money, not because I believed him, because I wanted to see what would happen, because I was a doctor now, trained in observation, and I needed data. He never paid me back. When I mentioned it to my father 3 months later, Martin said, "He's your brother now. Support him." He wasn't my brother. He was a stranger who'd learned to call my father Dad before I'd learned to call him anything. They married 6 months after I met her. I wasn't invited. It was intimate, my father said, on the phone, his voice distant, slightly slurred. Nothing formal. Don't worry. I worried. I worried about his slurring. I worried about his weight loss. I worried about the way Valeria answered his phone now, screened his calls, managed his schedule. I worried about the documents I saw on his desk when I visited. Papers he couldn't explain, signatures that looked like his but weren't quite right, transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. But I was a resident. I was working 80 hours a week. I told myself I'd check on him after my fellowship. I told myself I had time. Time is a lie we tell ourselves when we're afraid to act. The call came at 3 a.m. My phone in the on-call room, vibrating against my chest. A number I didn't recognize. A hospital I knew, the private one where my father had his executive checkups. Dr. Vasquez, a nurse's voice, professional, careful. "Your father has been admitted, stroke, massive, he's in ICU." I drove. I broke speed limits. I arrived in scrubs, still wearing my hospital ID, and I found Valeria in the hallway, perfect in a silk robe that looked like she'd thrown it on for effect. "He's very delicate," she said, blocking my path to the room. "The doctors say no visitors. He needs absolute calm." "I'm a doctor," I said. "I'm his daughter. I need to see him." She smiled, that smile. "Camilla, I know this is hard, but your father and I have agreements, medical directives. He trusted me to make these decisions. Please, don't make this difficult." I pushed past her, not violently, medically, the way you move around obstruction in an emergency. I entered the room. My father was unconscious. Intubated, ventilated, the machines breathing for him. He looked small. The man who'd built buildings, who'd dominated rooms, who'd measured his worth in square footage, he looked like a child in the hospital bed, diminished, vulnerable. I checked his chart. The stroke was hemorrhagic, bleeding in the brain, severe, prognosis guarded. But he was stable. He was not in a state that required visitor isolation. The absolute calm was Valeria's preference, not medical necessity. I stayed for 2 hours. I held his hand. I spoke to him because coma patients can hear, because the brain processes sound even when consciousness is absent, because my mother had taught me that presence is medicine even when cure is impossible. Valeria returned with security. "Dr. Vasquez, you need to leave. You're upsetting him. I'm his daughter, and I'm his wife. His legal medical proxy. Please." They escorted me out, not roughly, professionally. The way hospitals remove problems that don't have immediate solutions. I came back the next day and the next. Valeria blocked every attempt. She changed visiting hours. She restricted access. She told the nursing staff I was estranged, emotionally unstable, a danger to his recovery. I was a doctor at another hospital. I knew how this worked. She was building a narrative, creating distance, establishing control. And I was letting her because I believed in systems, in rules, in the idea that truth would eventually matter. My father died 3 months later. I was not there. I was not informed until after. Valeria called me, her voice thick with performance grief, to tell me the tragic news and the funeral arrangements, which were already planned, already paid for, already structured to exclude me. I sat in my apartment in the dark, and I felt something I hadn't felt since my mother's death. The understanding that I had failed. That presence is not enough when someone is stealing your access, your information, your right to say goodbye. The funeral was theater. Valeria in black designer dress, Tomás in a suit that cost more than my car, both of them performing grief for an audience of my father's business associates, his investors, his competitors. I was seated in the last row, behind the floral arrangements, invisible by design. Tomás gave a eulogy. He called Martin the father I never had but always needed. He spoke of lessons learned, of values passed down, of continuing the legacy. He cried on cue, the audience applauded. I didn't cry. I was past tears. I was in the space beyond grief, where emotions crystallize into something harder, sharper, more durable. The will reading was a week later. I was not invited. I learned about it from Mr. Castellanos, my father's lawyer, a man in his 70s, nervous, who called me from a payphone because his office phone was compromised. Dr. Vasquez, he said, his voice shaking. You need to see this. In person, today, I went. He showed me the will. Dated 2 months before the stroke. 2 months when my father was already showing signs of confusion, of forgetfulness, of the small cognitive slips that Valeria attributed to stress and overwork. The document was devastating in its completeness. Martin left everything to Valeria. The company, the properties, the investments, estimated at $12 million. But the cruelty was in the details. To my son Tomás, who has proven himself the true heir to my name, I leave 40% of my liquid assets and the family home, where he may raise his own family with the same dedication I showed. I was not mentioned. Not my name. Not my relationship. Not my 15 years of managing his household, my 6 years of medical education, my existence. I had been edited out, erased, made into a ghost while I was still breathing, but I was a doctor. I was trained to see what others missed, and I saw the signature my father's, but wrong. The loops too tight, the pressure inconsistent, the flourish he'd developed in his 40s absent. A forgery, a good one but a forgery. The date, 2 months before the stroke. But my father in that period had been increasingly confused. I'd noticed during my last visit. He'd asked me the same question 3 times in an hour. He'd forgotten the name of his company. He'd called me Valeria once, then laughed it off as tiredness. The notary, a name I didn't recognize. A firm that didn't exist in the state registry. A ghost who'd witnessed a ghost signing a ghost document. I looked at Mr. Castellanos. This is fake. He nodded, miserable. I suspected, but I couldn't prove. She threatened me, Dr. Vasquez. Said she'd ruin my reputation, my practice, my family. I have grandchildren. I didn't blame him. Fear is a currency more valuable than money in some economies, but I didn't accept his fear as my boundary. Thank you, I said, for telling me, for the copy, for your courage. I left. I didn't go to the police. Not yet. Valeria had lawyers, connections, a narrative already established. I needed more than suspicion. I needed proof. I needed a weapon that couldn't be dismissed, couldn't be buried, couldn't be bought. I needed to become the kind of doctor who treats diseases that don't appear on charts. The kind who understands that some cancers wear silk robes and call themselves wife. I started with the medical records. As next of kin, I had legal right to my father's healthcare documentation. I requested everything, from the stroke admission, from the years before, from the executive checkups that Valeria had managed. The pattern was clear to trained eyes. In the 6 months before the stroke, my father had been prescribed increasing doses of benzodiazepines, anti-anxiety medications that also cause confusion, memory loss, cognitive impairment. The prescribing psychiatrist was Dr. Alan Voss. I searched his name. Found his golf club. Found his photo on Valeria's Instagram, 3 months before the wedding. Caption: new friends. I found more. Blood tests showing therapeutic levels of anticoagulants that weren't prescribed, subtle, dangerous, increasing bleeding risk. Dietary supplements that Valeria administered, not listed in official records, that my father took because they helped me sleep. He hadn't just been confused when he signed that will. He'd been drugged, sedated, chemically compromised into compliance. But medical evidence alone wouldn't be enough. Valeria would claim concern, caregiving, devoted wife managing a difficult husband. She'd hired expensive lawyers, built expensive narratives. I needed something she couldn't buy, something that existed outside her control. I found it in Roberto. Roberto was 60, a nurse who'd worked my father's floor in the final weeks. He called me, not the other way around, after seeing my name in a news article about a medical conference. Dr. Vasquez, he said, his voice rough with age and caution. I took care of your father. I saw things I think you should know. We met in a diner, far from the hospital, far from Valeria's influence. He was nervous, checking exits, speaking in fragments, but what he told me changed everything. 2 weeks before he died, she brought him in a wheelchair, said he wanted to update his documents. He didn't know where he was, didn't recognize me, though I'd been his nurse for 3 weeks. She held his hand, guided the pen. There was a man with a notary stamp, but he didn't check ID, didn't ask questions, just stamped and left. Roberto had video, taken on his phone, hidden in his pocket because something didn't smell right. The footage was shaky, partial but clear enough, my father drooling slightly, eyes unfocused, while Valeria held his hand and moved it across paper. Tomás in the corner, smiling. The notary looking away, complicit paid. I held the phone with shaking hands. I watched my father, the man who'd taught me blueprints, who'd been distant but present, who'd at least never pretended to be something he wasn't, reduced to a puppet. A signature machine. A legal fiction. Why, I asked Roberto. Why risk your job, your pension for this? He looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. My mother, he said, she had dementia. My sister did the same thing, took her house, her savings, her dignity. I watched and I did nothing. I told myself it was family business. I was wrong then. I didn't want to be wrong again. I paid for his coffee, I thanked him. I left with the video, the testimony, the beginning of a case that Valeria couldn't buy her way out of. But I didn't go to the police, not directly. I went to something more devastating. I contacted James Chen, a financial journalist at Forbes, known for exposing corporate fraud, inheritance scams, the predatory widows who targeted wealthy older men. I'd read his articles during medical school, admired his tenacity, never imagined I'd need him. I sent him the video, the medical records, the pattern of Valeria's financial transfers, accounts I'd traced through public records, shell companies she'd established, properties she'd already begun selling. The documentation of her previous identity, not Valeria Morales, but Elena Vargas, with a fraud conviction in another country, a name change, a fresh start. James Chen investigated further. He found what I couldn't. Valeria's arrival in the city 3 years earlier with $800 and a plan. Her systematic targeting of wealthy widowers, my father was the third, the most successful. The first two had died of natural causes, their estates absorbed by her shell companies, their families too embarrassed or too powerless to challenge. His article was published on a Tuesday. The Widow's Web, how a convicted fraudster married, drugged, and robbed a real estate empire. The impact was immediate. The financial world, my father's world, ran on reputation and information. Valeria's accounts were frozen by banks terrified of regulatory scrutiny. Business partners who trusted her management demanded audits. The IRS, already interested in my father's complex tax structures, opened a full investigation. Tomás, discovering that his inheritance was inaccessible, that his mother's crimes were public, fled. He took what cash he could find, what jewelry he could steal, and disappeared to a country with no extradition. I don't know where he is, I don't care. Valeria was arrested at the airport. First-class ticket to a non-extradition country, designer luggage, 3 passports with 3 different names. The video from Roberto was central evidence. The medical records showed systematic poisoning. The forged will was exposed as fraud. She was convicted of attempted murder, fraud, identity theft, and forgery. 15 years. I attended the sentencing, not for satisfaction, for documentation, for the record, for the understanding that some justice, however slow, however partial, is possible. I recovered the inheritance. Not all of it, legal fees, business debts, partner lawsuits, and the IRS reduced $12 million to $3 million, but I recovered the house. The family home where I'd grown up, where my mother had read by the window, where my father had disappeared into blueprints and grief. I didn't live in it. It was too large, too empty, too full of ghosts. I sold it to a developer who wanted to demolish it, build condos, maximize value, but I bought it back first. Through a shell company, at market rate, using the last of my recovered funds. I didn't keep it as a house. I converted it into something else. The Camila Vasquez Free Clinic, named for my mother, the nurse who'd held hands and remembered birthdays. Open to anyone without insurance, without documentation, without the money that my father had accumulated and that I refused to hoard. I work there. Not as director, as doctor. I see patients, pull all-nighters, live in a small apartment above the clinic. I don't drive my father's car. I don't post luxury photos. I don't validate myself through inheritance. But once a year, on the anniversary of my father's death, I visit a grave. Not his, Valeria's. I leave a white flower and a newspaper clipping. Doctor exposes fraud, opens free clinic. I don't pray. I don't forgive. I just remember. I remember that the woman who tried to erase me is now erased herself, and that the money she stole became medicine for people who need it. My daughter, I adopted her 3 years ago from the foster system. A girl whose mother was lost to addiction and whose father was unknown asks me sometimes about my parents. Were they good? She asks. My mother was, I say. My father was complicated. He loved in the only way he knew, and he was stolen from me before I could teach him better ways. She doesn't fully understand. She's 7, but she will. I'll teach her as my mother taught me. That love is not what people leave you in a will. It's what you build with what remains. I'm Camila. I'm 33 years old. I have a clinic, a daughter, and a habit of reading charts twice that my residents find obsessive. I have a father who was forged into a fiction, a mother who was real, and a life that proves you can turn theft into healing if you're willing to do the work. See you in the next story.